Hello, everyone. My name is Aphrodite Gonu, and I'm the advisor to the contemporary program of the Museum of Cycladic Art. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. In English for our speaker, for Jennifer. I should say that this talk is part of the parallel program for the exhibition of Marlene Dumas that is closing this Sunday. I hope most of you have seen it. Marlene Dumas Cycladic Blues, and we would like to thank Harry and Lana David for making this parallel program possible with their support. And I would also like to mention our contemporary support committee that support the whole contemporary program, and our sponsors Eurobank, Neon, and Neon. And a few words for about Jennifer. Jennifer Higgie, we've known each other for many, many years. I've known her as the editor of Frieze magazine for many years. The years that Frieze magazine was the magazine, especially in Europe, but anyway, we considered it the magazine that everybody read. Right when London was becoming the center of art in Europe, Tate was opening, Frieze Fair started. So Jennifer was really sort of one of the central figures in contemporary art at the time. Things, of course, evolve, change. Jennifer is foremost a writer. She is actually also an artist, but has been writing most of her life. She's Australian. She was born in Australia, but lives in London. Her recent books that you can actually find at our bookshop include The Other Side, A Story of Women, Art, and the Spirit World, and The Mirror and the Palette, Rebellion, Revolution, and Resilience, 500 Years of Women's Self-Portraits. One of the reasons that I thought of inviting Jennifer to talk in the context of our Marlene Dumas show is because she has written so much about women artists. She had, for many years, also a podcast that we all religiously followed. At the time, it was called Bow Down. Now, you can still find it as Jennifer Higgie. And she posted, right when, again, Instagram was just starting to be the thing at the time. Now it's like something different. But at the time, she was uploading a female artist every day that was not so known by her date of birth. So every day it would be the birthday of this artist, and she would inform us with a new artist, and we all followed it, and we learned so much from this podcast for many years. She's the host of the National Gallery of Australia's podcast Artists. I hope I pronounced that right. Her 5-part essay for BBC Radio 3, Artists and the Spirit World, is available on BBC iPlayer. She has a great website where you can find everything about what she has done all these years. And she has a very interesting way of looking at things. I think we kind of gave her carte blanche to talk about whatever she wanted around Marlene Dumas. So I think she will start, Marlene Dumas will be a starting point, and then she will tell us a lot about women and self-portraits. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much, Aphrodite, for that very generous introduction. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I love Greece. I love Athens. In fact, a lot of my recent book, The Other Side, was written in Greece. And the Cycladic Museum has always been one of my favorite museums because I'm a great believer that the art of the past is really relevant to the present. And the art of the past was, of course, once contemporary. And I think it's really important to look at historic art, not as something that is dusty and put off in a room under harsh lights, but that engages with the present. And that's why I was so excited to come and visit this exhibition with Marlene Dumas, because I've known her for a long time and I have deep admiration for her as an artist. And I was so excited to see the kind of conversation that she would have with cycladic art, because she's an artist who works very instinctively, but she also is a deep intellectual. She has a fierce sense of the rights and wrongs of culture, and that art is a force for good. She's also a deep believer in that an artist might have an intention for a work of art, but at the same time, the work of art is ultimately a mysterious object, that it's open to interpretation. And so I thought that I would do my talk today as a kind of conversation in a way, because I think it's Marlene Dumas having a conversation with the past. So I used her images as a sort of springboard. But, I forgot to thank Aphrodite very much for inviting me. It really is such an honor. And also Delegina for being such an incredible help and so wise, and giving me great feedback on an earlier version of this talk. So thank you so much. So I thought I would start with this painting by Marlene Dumas, Evil is Banal. And it's titled after the great Hannah Arendt essay on fascism and Nazism in particular, when she had been going to the Nuremberg trials. And Marlene Dumas, of course, is South African, even though she's lived in Holland for a very long time. And she wanted to do a self-portrait of herself as a white woman living on African lands, that she, in some ways, was complicit in the terrible sort of post-colonial situation that was in the South Africa that she was growing up. But when she talks about this painting, she's also very clear that although it was motivated by the idea of self-portraiture and putting herself as within this debate around apartheid South Africa, she also says it works on very many different levels. And I thought this was a great quote by her. "My art is situated between the pornographic tendency to reveal everything and the erotic inclination to hide what it is all about." And I think that's a very beautiful way she's described the way that she works, which is, it works on many different levels. And although she hasn't done lots of self-portraits, I was very interested to look at the self-portraits that she has made, because I'm particularly interested in self-portraiture as a female activity. And I went to art school in the 80s and 90s in Australia, and what was really fascinating to me when I started to learn about women in art was that although I had a great art education in some ways, no one ever told me that there were extraordinary women making art in the Renaissance in Italy, that there were extraordinarily interesting women in the Middle Ages, that women were always making art from then to now. And I think one of the very interesting things about self-portraiture and women, that I'll be going into the history of self-portraiture and women, is that when women had no political agency in pre-modern times, when they had to do everything through the permission of their fathers or their brothers or their husbands, they often weren't allowed to be apprentices, they were barred from art schools, and so often if they had a mirror and access to a studio, they could paint themselves. So you'll see a lot of the paintings that I'm going to be showing you. Self-portraiture for women was an extremely radical act. So here we've got Marlene Dumas' self-portrait at noon from 2008, and she painted this self-portrait after the death of her beloved mother. And I think it's an amazingly poignant still life. You can see how rapidly she's applied the paint, but it's also very thin. There's a kind of transparency to it. And to me, it embodies that feeling that you have when you have grief, that you feel transparent, you feel so fragile. And then we move on to this wonderful self-portrait that is in the exhibition upstairs, and I assume you've all seen this extraordinary exhibition. And this is called 50 Plus. And interestingly, it was painted over 8 years, which I find interesting because it's not a very big painting. But obviously she returned to it again and again and again. And you can see the layers that have been built up in this painting, with her constantly going back to reflect on herself as an aging woman, a woman who is, going into the next period of her life. But this wasn't just purely an image about Marlene Dumas' face. It was actually influenced by this sculpture. And I really recommend, by the way, the catalogue to this exhibition, Cycladic Blues. It's absolutely wonderful. And Marlene Dumas wrote in that, and she talks about, and then there are my paintings of older women. One could even call these self-portraits. So even when they're not explicitly self-portraits, often they come from a position of Marlene Dumas talking about herself in the world. She says, 50 plus was painted and repainted over time, inspired by a postcard of a close-up of a Roman marble copy of a Hellenistic sculpture of a drunken old woman with a wine jug in her hand. Some historians even link her to depictions of satyrs in terms of posture, who paid tribute to Dionysus through her intoxication. And so this is again another example of Marlene Dumas' conversation with the past. How even though she's a very contemporary painter and a very modern painter, she's constantly looking to the past to see how other artists might have resolved certain representative problems that might have presented themselves to them. And then we've got these two big paintings which were painted for this exhibition. And again, Old is on the left and Phantom Age on right. So again, in 2025, she's now in her 70s, and she's thinking about herself as an aging woman. But one of the things that I really love about these two paintings is they're very unspecific in a way in terms of their very precise meaning, which is as it should be, all good painting is. But you can see here with Marlene Dumas standing next to these paintings, these are not the traditional paintings we know of old women who are small and fragile and diminished. This is woman as power. You know, this is woman who is, in a way, having a conversation with cycladic art, is having a conversation with classical art. She's placing herself in the story that she was, for so long, excluded from. And this is what she writes here. These two works have the same source, an image of a Roman copy of a Hellenistic sculpture of the 2nd century called the Old Market Woman. And here we can see the Old Market Woman. And I really love this quote by Marlene Dumas, because she loves a glass of wine, as many of us do. And she says, to my joy, I was told that this ancient lady, my muse for the night, was not just being respectfully old and wise, but was apparently an aged courtesan on her way to the festival of Dionysus, the god of wine. So she's also making a reference to her own enjoyment of nocturnal reveries. So just to stress this idea of the ambiguities that can exist within being a female painter. Even today, when women are getting lots of exhibitions, if you live in certain countries, not in other countries, but women are getting a lot more exposure. They're being collected by major museums, but they're still woefully underrepresented. But Marlene Dumas, who is also, as I'm sure you all know, a really gifted writer as well as a gifted artist, and I love her writings. She writes really clearly and humorously and strangely and mystically about art and what it is to be an artist. And she wrote this in her longer essay from 1993, Women and Painting. I paint because I am a religious woman. I believe in eternity. Painting doesn't freeze time. It circulates and recycles time like a wheel that turns. Those who were first might well be last. Painting is a very slow art. It doesn't travel with the speed of light. That's why dead painters shine so bright. So I want to show you some of the dead painters who I think shine so brightly. And that some of them I know have influenced Marlene Dumas, others I'm not sure. But I feel that she's in this long lineage of these brilliant women who have been making art. And I think this is so beautiful, this quote that's in the exhibition upstairs. An artist is an artist because of other artists. So when I was delving into Marlene Dumas' exploration of the past, I came across this really extraordinary sculpture, and it's possibly one of the earliest, or it is one of the earliest known representations of the human face. As you can see, it's from 3200 BC, around there. Carved white marble female face is probably a depiction of Inanna, the ancient Mesopotamian goddess of war, love, and fertility. And Inanna also was the first known poet, published poet that we know of, and she was a woman. So again, another first for women. And in 2020, Marlene Dumas painted this mask. And so again, you can see her constantly looking back to see who were these powerful women of the past who we should honor now. So I think this is a good moment to leap now into the 13th century. And this, in the Western canon, is possibly the earliest self-portrait by a woman that we know of. There may be others, but this is the one that's often cited. And what I love about this is it's so playful. And Marlene Dumas, on many levels, is a very playful artist, I think. She often loves to play with tropes. She plays with tradition. She plays with paint. If you ever meet her, she's got a great sense of humor. She's always laughing. And you can see here that, so Clarissa, she only went by one name, and she's a 13th century German illuminator. And she included a self-portrait in a Psalter that she was illustrating, which is a pretty cheeky thing to do. And you can see that she's swinging off it, in her long robe. And she's got between her, so you can see between her hands, she's written the word Clarissa. So I have a feeling Clarissa was a lot of fun. Now this isn't necessarily a self-portrait, but it's one of the earliest depictions of a woman painting a self-portrait. We don't know who painted this self-portrait, but, sorry, I've got to put on my glasses. It's an illustration from 1401 of the great Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio's book concerning famous women, which depicts the ancient figure Marcia painting her self-portrait. And what I love about this is that it's sort of a triple self-portrait. Or it could be a triple self-portrait if it was her who actually painted it, but it was probably someone else. So we can see Marcia painted 3 times here, and she's got her little palette. Where is she? Down here. Around here, you can see the palette. So this is the earliest depiction we have of a woman actually painting herself. And interestingly, there's a Greek connection to this, because Boccaccio, even though he called her Marcia, he was inspired in the stories of these great women by the renowned female painter from ancient Greece, Iaia of Kyzikos, excuse my pronunciations. By the way, I'm so sorry this isn't in Greek. I feel very embarrassed that I'm imposing my English on you. So now, when I wrote my book on self-portraits, when I wrote my book on self-portraits, I think this was the inciting painting. This I could not believe when I saw it. Now, it looks like a pretty ordinary little painting. It's quite small, it's only the size of a book, but it's 1548, and it's a self-portrait by a woman. Now, what happened at this time, often, we can assume, because it happened much later, often if women made paintings, once they died, the paintings became attributed to men. But Catharina von Hemerson, who was in Antwerp in the 16th century, she was very lucky because her father was a painter, which is why she had access to a studio. She painted this self-portrait, and she wrote in, up here, the top here, you can see the writing here. She said, so that there would be no confusion, I, Catharina van Hemerson, have painted myself in 1548. Her age is 20. So she's a 20-year-old young girl painting. She's painting a picture of the Virgin to show that she's a respectable woman, even though she's an artist. But possibly the most remarkable thing about this is it's the first painting we know of in history of an artist depicting themselves painting, of either gender. So there were self-portraits being done at the time by artists like Dürer and Van Dyck, but they were sort of, the artist was picturing himself like a Christ-like figure, not at work. And so the more I looked at this painting and thought about it, I thought, my God, this is such a radical gesture, even though she looks a bit scared. She's saying, I am a woman and I am an artist in 1548. Imagine being the first one to do something like that, to picture yourself painting. I mean, it's an amazingly radical painting. And when I saw this painting, I thought, well, what else don't I know about women in art? And a lot, it turned out. I didn't know about the great Sophonisba Anguissola. Now, she came a bit later, 1559. Now, she is the most prolific self-portraitist between Dürer and Rembrandt. I was never taught about her at art school. And she's also an amazingly brilliant painter. She was also a very playful painter. Now, what I love about this, now this is ostensibly a self-portrait, right? But the title of it is Bernardino Campi Painting Sophonisba Anguissola. So although she painted it, she titled it after her teacher, Bernardino Campi, who taught her painting, and he's painting her. But who's bigger? She is. So it's a very sly dig at her painting teacher, that she's saying, actually, I'm taller and bigger and stronger than him. And she also depicted him with a mahl stick, which is that thing here. And most very prolific and brilliant painters at the time would never show themselves with a mahl stick. So she's slightly saying he needs a bit of support to make his paintings as well. So she's being extremely cheeky here to her teacher. And I thought, considering this is a bit of a riddle of a self-portrait, I love this quote by Marlene Dumas: "Through art, nothing gets solved, so everything remains relevant. Contemporary issues are older than time." And, the battle between the sexes obviously still going on. Now, another artist who I hadn't been taught about was the great Lavinia Fontana. Now, she is extraordinary. She not only had 11 children, but she was also an extremely prolific and very well-regarded artist in Italy during the Renaissance. Now, I was thinking about her because I read this quote by Marlene Dumas: "To show or not to show, in art, that is the question. It is not that I want to see everybody without their clothes on, but it's very stupid that in Hollywood love scenes, the males always hide their sex." Now, what is interesting, at the time that Lavinia Fontana was painting nudes, and she's probably, most likely, the first female artist to paint fully nude women. And it's more than likely that these are self-portraits, even though they're not titled self-portraits, because it would have been very difficult for her to get naked models. She wouldn't have been allowed. It would have been seen as far too bohemian and licentious, and so more than likely she used herself as a model. So you can see her here again, Minerva dressing, and there's this very interesting tradition in the Renaissance of women picturing themselves as gods or godlike. And again, I think that's a really sly dig at their role in society, that they're saying, yes, I might just be an artist, and I might just be a naked woman, and I might be putting on my clothes, but actually I'm godlike, goddess-like. And I thought just a quick reminder here of Marlene Dumas. And of course, Marlene Dumas is really constantly thinking about the cycladic figurines when she's here, and she's responding to them with works from the past or works from the present that she intersperses with them. And so you can see this beautiful figurine and this beautiful ink drawing called Anguish from 25 years ago. So she's seeing in these figurines a whole range of emotions. Often people talk about the cycladic figurines as if they're literally stony-faced, but actually stay with them and you get a lot of feeling from them, I think. And this is a page from the book. This is a really extraordinary spread from the book. So on the left, in the book Cycladic Blues, we've got the early Cycladic period head, and then to the right we've got Marlene Dumas Immaculate from 2003, and this too is a form of self-portrait as well. And actually, Aphrodite was saying to me earlier that this is one painting, Immaculate, that she never wants to get rid of. And I think it's really important that to stress Marlene Dumas' relationship to the body. Sometimes people have lazily called her pornographic, but I think that's so far from the truth. She's very honest about bodies and what bodies can do and how they function and what parts of our bodies we need and the parts of our bodies as women that have been too long covered up. And so she's very frank. Life begins and starts and ends in the body, and that's what she's constantly highlighting. And when she did this painting of Dorothy Delight, it's a sort of pornographic pose, but she delighted in the power and strength and beauty and grace of this woman. And again, I think with these, her depictions of female genitalia, she's again in conversation with art history. Now, this is one of the most famous paintings of the 19th century. Scandalous, discussed. It was for a long time hidden when it was displayed behind curtains. Gustave Courbet, who of course was the great realist painter of 19th century France, he did this as a commission. The whole story of why the painting came into being is really interesting. But what's fascinating about this painting by Courbet is, like Marlene Dumas, and in the way that she's been influenced by it, is because it's not pornographic. It's a very simple and straightforward depiction of a woman's body. And at this time, women's bodies were not looked at in this way in the 19th century. They were idealized. They were hidden behind, you know, huge dresses. They were, the idea that a woman was a living, breathing, sexual object with genitalia was not discussed. So Marlene Dumas often had conversations with this painting. Now I'm going to leap back to one of my favorite artists, back to the Baroque. So now we have the great Artemisia Gentileschi. And I mentioned before about how women in the Renaissance, they often depicted themselves as goddesses or as the embodiment of art, as the embodiment of painting. So this painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, which she did in England actually at the Royal Court, and it's now in the Royal Collection in England, what she's doing here, again, is an extraordinarily radical gesture for a Baroque artist. It's a painting, again, like the one by Catharina van Hemessen, of her painting. She's so busy painting, she can't even pause to look out at the viewer. She's saying, no, I'm really busy here. And we can't see, we're not privy to what she's painting. And at this time, in portraiture, there were very strict conventions about how portraits should be depicted. For example, the locket around her neck, the towel's hair. If you were painting the embodiment of painting, you had to paint the woman as having messy hair, as if she's right in the middle of her activities. She's meant to have a locket around a head around her neck that embodies the spirit of painting. There were lots of these conventions. And Artemisia takes these, but she's not a woman being depicted by a man. She's a woman herself being depicted by a woman. So, and the sheer energy and activeness of this painting is really amazing. But she, again, wasn't the only woman doing this. In Bologna, we've got Elisabetta Serrani, who is a really extraordinary character. She died very tragically at the age of 26. But by the time she had died, she had painted altarpieces. She had painted many, many paintings for the Medicis. She had painted a lot of self-portraits, and she had also started the first art school for women in Europe. And again, Elisabetta Serrani here is painting herself again as the embodiment of painting, which is, I think, so radical. I met a young art history student recently, an Italian woman who was studying in Bologna, and I said, the great Elisabetta Serrani. And she said, who? And she was doing art history, and she wasn't taught about Elisabetta Serrani. It's like, yeah. Now, we've got another self-portrait by Artemisia Gentileschi here, and it's self-portrait as lute player. Now, what's really interesting about this is that she was very good friends with another young artist called Giovanna Garzoni. And Giovanna Garzoni, they probably traveled together. This is her, Giovanna Garzoni's homage to her friend's self-portrait with a lute, because you can see the lute here, and Giovanna Garzoni was apparently a very gifted musician. But really radically, she doesn't just paint herself as a self-portrait of a goddess like Minerva, like Lavinia did, but she paints herself as Apollo. She says she is godlike. She painted this at the age of 18. And she actually became famous for her extraordinary still lifes, which you must look up if you have time, because they're remarkable. And so she's painting herself as the god of music, prophecy, healing, and the sun. So she's not being modest, at a time when women were taught to be modest, to be self-deprecating, to not hold their power. She's saying, I am as powerful as a god. And I think this is in direct conversation with Marlene Dumas' self-portraits, you know, the power. And she's very unflinching about aging, say, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. And again, around the same time, if we go to Holland, we've got the great Judith Leyster. Now, Judith Leyster paints herself at 21, and there's no way she would be, she shows herself painting, and there's no way she would be painting with this ruff. I mean, it would be really difficult. And she's got her best dress on. She's holding 18 brushes, and she's painting the kind of painting that was popular at the time, that was made popular by the great Frans Hals, where he painted people laughing and drinking. It's not like in Italy where they're painting the Virgin Mary. Here they're painting people going to the pub, basically. And you can see here a glimpse of a man making merry. Now, after she died, Judith Leyster, she was an extraordinary artist, and her work was this self-portrait, and it's a self-portrait, it's so clear, was considered a portrait of Judith Leyster by Frans Hals until the late 19th century, when it was discovered to be actually a self-portrait. So now she's finding her rightful place in the art historical canon. And in 2016, I think it was Sotheby's, one of the big auction houses, was called to a castle in England because they had all these paintings in the attic that they wanted to find. And they found this painting in 2016. And it's another portrait by Judith Leyster, but 25 years after the one we've just seen. And what is wonderful about this is she's very unflinchingly painting herself as an aging woman. She's put on weight, she's looking out, she's a bit more tired, she's not laughing so hard, but she's still an artist. And again, at a time when women are so idealized in painting, this is a radical gesture. And this, of course, is related to a portrait that was done in the next century by the great Rosalba Carrière. And Rosalba Carrière was Italian, and she was basically the great, it was called pastel painting, a master of pastel painting. So she was drawing in pastels and then scumbling them slightly with brushes, so this way of pastel painting. And here she's done a self-portrait as Winter. So she's depicting herself very unflinchingly as an aging woman. Again, a really extraordinary, sort of wide-eyed, open, clear, honest depiction of herself. Then we start getting a few more women artists in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And Angelica Kaufmann was a fantastic Swiss painter, and she moved to England and became prolific. And she was one of the only women founders of the Royal Academy in London in the 1780s. And again, she was a very gifted musician. And here she's depicting herself being torn between, a bit like the embodiment of, say, Artemisia as the embodiment of painting. Here she's being torn between being a writer, a musician or a painter. And then we're going to leap forward a little bit further to the great Marie Bashkirtsev. Now, again, she was an artist who died very young. She died in her 20s of tuberculosis. It was tragic. But she was an absolutely extraordinary artist. And you can see with the harp in the background, she was also a brilliant musician. So many of these artists, they were wonders. And actually, Vasari, in his famous Portraits of Painters, the book that he wrote in the 16th century, he described women artists as wonders. And it can seem a little patronizing, but in a way he was right. For these women to have these careers, not only as brilliant artists, but often as writers and musicians, they were extraordinary. Now, Marie Bashkirtsev, so she paints herself when she knows she's probably dying. You can see how young she is. But she kept an enormously frank diary for about, from the age of about 18 until her death. And it's very frank. She expresses her fury about not being allowed to go out on her own. She expresses her fury that she can't have the access to education that other male painters can have. She talks about sexual urges. She talks about her body. She talks about love and lust and feeling. It's an extraordinary read. And after she died, her mother edited it. Her mother edited some of the more racy bits out. And it became a bestseller across Europe. But what she said about herself, and I love this, again, it's a very bold woman, she said, "I am the most interesting book of all." And you can buy this book still, and it's a really fantastic read, if you want to get a very up-close and personal portrayal of an artist, a female artist, trying to be an expressive and powerful woman in the 19th century. And she then was to influence the great Paula Modersohn-Becker, who's one of my favorite artists. And she's actually, a self-portrait by her is on the cover of my book, The Mirror and the Palette. Now, Paula Modersohn-Becker, again, a terrible story. She died young in childbirth, but she wasn't actually pregnant when she painted this painting. Very interestingly, she titled it Self-Portrait on her 6th wedding anniversary. Now, it was around this time that she actually left her husband in Vorpsbeda, which was an artist colony, and moved to Paris, where she became best friends with Rainer Maria Rilke. And he wrote an extraordinary poem, A Lament, when she died. When she painted this extraordinary self-portrait, because it's the first self-portrait that we know of by a woman that is explicitly a self-portrait and semi-naked, she wasn't pregnant, but she was pregnant with ideas, and she had just left her husband. So again, it's quite an ironic title, because basically she's saying, I'm leaving my husband, I'm filled with ideas, I don't want children, I'm going to paint in Paris, which she did, and she painted a series of extraordinary paintings, but in the end, poverty was too hard for her to cope with, and she did move back to her husband, who was a painter. He was a very gifted painter too. Tragically, she was pregnant and she died as soon as the baby was born. Terrible. But again, she left behind a diary, and she was very influenced by Marie Bashkirtsev. And in her diary, she writes that she'd been reading the journal of Marie Bashkirtsev, and her thoughts enter my bloodstream and make me very sad. I say she does, if only I could accomplish something. My existence seems humiliating to me. We don't have the right to strut around, not until we've made something of ourselves. But it's also a diary that is full of joy and love of painting and love of life. It's a very wonderful book. And I'm going to move from the painter to the model. Now, in this painting by Pierre-Auguste Renoir, you can see this delightful young woman dancing, and she was one of the most famous models of the time. And she appears in paintings by so many artists, there are too many to mention now, but mainly by Renoir. She was Renoir's favorite model, and also by Toulouse-Lautrec, who became a close friend of hers. Now you can see here, it's a very idealized portrait of a woman. Now she was very interesting because she became a renowned artist herself, but unlike all of the other say, women painting around the time who became very famous, the Impressionist women like Mary Cassatt, Bertha Morisot, Eva Gonzalez, and others. She was very working class. She was born to a washerwoman mother. She didn't know her father. She was illegitimate. She was working as a circus rider from the age of 10, and a million other and one jobs. But she became obsessed when she became a model herself. How are these artists painting? And so she taught herself how to paint by looking at the artists who were painting her. And you can see here, for example, this is an extraordinary print by hers from 1895. She's not depicting women as idealized beings. I mean, think of the portrayal of Renoir of her. Here, she's portraying working women who are exhausted, they're at their toilette, and she does endless drawings of her friends, basically, who are working women. And there's such a deep respect, I think, and love for her fellow working women in these pictures. And again, like Marlene Dumas' paintings, nudity here isn't something pornographic. It's something that is paying homage to the naked body. And you can see here, we leap forward about a decade. And this is Suzanne Valadon painting a very racy self-portrait, one of the first full-length naked self-portraits. Even though it's called Adam and Eve, she pictures herself here with her new boyfriend. She'd left her husband, and she was now going out with her brother's best friend. He was 25 years younger than her, and he was also an artist, and she had a right old time. And you can see that she's really enjoying life here. And she said, I paint people to get to know them. I paint with the stubbornness I need for living, and I found that all painters who love their art do the same. And I think it's, again, really interesting to go back to Marlene Dumas and the cycladic figurines and look at the portrayal of nakedness in terms of female representation here. So now I'm going to move on to one of my favorite artists in terms of her self-portraits. There was an exhibition of hers at the Royal Academy a few years ago, and there was this extraordinary room which had 24 self-portraits, and I'm just showing you a few here, but Helene Scherfbach pictured herself from being a very young artist to a very old artist, and again, it's incredibly revealing about her state of mind. It's painting herself as also a psychological portrait. And this was a quote of hers: "Intimacy and interiority, what matters is at an angle." So it's not about looking at things front on, it's about looking at them from all angles. You look at her here, this is a few years later, in 1939, and you can see she was in Sweden, and this is at the outbreak of war. It's a terrifying time. You can see that the fear is consuming her here. She moved into a hotel in Stockholm, and she painted and she painted and she painted, and she had her easel next to her bed, like a family member really looking after her. And very sadly, she got cancer and she died in 1944, and this is a self-portrait she painted just before she died. And you can see here it's an extraordinarily honest and open and terrifying self-portrait. She's seeing her own dissolution. And I was thinking about Helene Scherfbach's self-portraits when I was looking at Marlene Dumas' self-portraits in their frankness and their openness and their honesty. And of course, lots of women started to make art in the 20th century. And these are just a few of them. I could show you hundreds of pictures. I found this really fascinating, the story of Lois Mailey Jones. She was an African-American artist trying to make work in a very racist country. At the time, she moved to Paris, and she found she was treated much better as an artist in Paris, as a black artist in Paris. And of course, she's learning about Picasso and Braque and all of these artists who were very interested and influenced by African art. And you can see here, she places some African figurines behind her, because she's saying, if they are influenced by African art, well, I have a much greater reason to be influenced by it. And then she spent the rest of her long life actually traveling through Africa and researching African art and supporting young African artists. I think she traveled through about 54 countries. She went to every country in Africa. She was really extraordinary artist. And then if we move ahead to like the 1960s, of course, then we have the explosion of feminism. And we get women artists using their bodies as a way of exploring ideas around repressive patriarchal societies, about exploring myth. You can see the great Carolee Schneemann here. She's at once a very modern woman using her body as a sort of powerful tool of expression, but she's also referring to ancient myths, like biblical myths. She's got the snakes on her body here. And she's sort of reclaiming the idea of the female nude. And she says here the female nude is part of a revered tradition, although she is not to take authority over depictions of her nudity, because of course it's mainly been men painting female nudes. She is just to be available. And so she really responded against this idea of male portrayals or ideal portrayals of female nudity to reclaim her own expression. In sculpture, we have extraordinary artists like Alina Shapavnikov, who was a Polish Holocaust survivor. She was in Auschwitz, she managed to survive, and she came out and she, again, placed herself in the center of representations of female nudity, the body, the fragile body. She, more than anyone, had seen what brutality could do to her, do to women, do to people, do to humans. And she said about using her body and about using nudity, of all the manifestations of the ephemeral, the human body is the most vulnerable, the only source of all joy, all suffering, and all truth. I think that's an amazing statement. Now I'm just going to whip ahead 14 years, and we've got the great Alice Neel. Now, Alice Neel was one of the great portraitists. She painted neighbors, lovers, friends, families for over 60 years, and she's now known as one of the great portrait artists of the 20th century. But she only very rarely painted herself. In the 1930s, she painted herself with her lover, and they were mainly sketches, actually, rather than full-blooded paintings. But she decided to paint this painting, which she spent 5 years on, and she decided to paint herself in the blue striped chair where she always put her subjects, and she put herself. And again, like Marlene Dumas' depiction of women aging, there's nothing abashed here about being naked and being old. This body has served her well. It has borne her children. She has traveled through life with it. It's allowed her to be a painter. You know, and so this is a painting, I think, of a woman who is very comfortable in her own flesh. And when it came out, when it was sort of released, of course, there was a great scandal around it, and people said it was scandalous that an old woman should paint herself. So, that people were outraged. But Marlene Dumas is a huge admirer of Alice Neel, and there's a wonderful essay she wrote called "Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore," which you can read on Marlene Dumas' website, actually. And this is just a small fragment of it, and I thought this was wonderful. Marlene Dumas sticking up for Alice Neel. When her paintings are good, they vibrate and tremble with an energy as nervous as Munch. It's a mixture of Picasso and Matisse, maybe stirred, not shaken. It's both harsh and sweet. It deals with both love and fear simultaneously. She moves fast. The unflattering criticism she received about her nude self-portrait at aged 80 is unforgivably stupid. And then, of course, we come closer to the modern era, and there are so many different female artists painting themselves in different ways. This is a wonderful self-portrait by Evelyn Nicodemus, which is the first self-portrait by a black woman to enter the collection of the National Portrait Gallery in London. And it shows that a woman has many identities, and this was a woman who had moved from Tanzania at the age of 19 and lived in Sweden for 10 years, and then I think she moved to Scotland, and she said, "I refuse to be a prisoner of racism, sexism, and the past." Then we have the great Maria Lasnik, the Austrian artist, an extraordinary slew of self-portraits, and actually wrote an essay about Maria Lasnik when she had her exhibition at the Serpentine. And this is what I wrote. She continues to ask questions of what it means to know your skin and yet be startled by the limitations it presents, of how to continue to live in a body in which you have lived all your life and which will eventually kill you, of how possible it is to understand the elusive inner worlds of the people with whom you choose to coexist. And any painting of a body is, of course, also a portrait of a mind. And I wanted to include that quote because I thought I could have easily written that about Marlene Dumas. And of course, if we're talking about minds, we have to mention Louise Bourgeois. Of course, there was a great exhibition of her work here. And this is a wonderful self-portrait of her from 1990 to 94, and she says, an artist can show things that other people are terrified of expressing. And Louise Bourgeois, of course, was an incredible artist, and she was also a lifelong, she was in psychoanalysis for a very long time, and her artwork is a sort of form of exorcism, of working through her unconscious. And I was really struck, looking at Marlene Dumas' painting, at this painting and how it echoes, in a way, the child figure in the Louise Bourgeois self-portrait. And this is Marlene Dumas painting her daughter in 1994, but she's painted her daughter as a painter. And she says, and this is Marlene Dumas writing, historically it was always the male artist who was the painter and his model the female. Here we have a female child, the source my daughter, taking the main role. She painted herself. The model becomes the artist. And this is, I think, again, a wonderful example of the lineage of female artists that Marlene Dumas is sort of handing the baton to her daughter. And I just wanted to remind here of, again, the great connection between Marlene Dumas' paintings of herself and the past. I thought the juxtapositions in this exhibition are absolutely extraordinary. And This is my last quote by Marlene Dumas. And this is from a wonderful book of her writings, which I really recommend you get if you haven't got it already, called Sweet Nothings, Notes and Texts, and it's a compilation of her writings. And she says, I know that neither images nor words can escape the drunkenness and longing caused by the turning of the world. Words and images drink the same wine. There is no purity to protect. Thank you very much.